In 2016, just 2 years after the Modi government came to power in the centre, the editors of the RSS-affiliated magazines Panchjanya and Organizer Weekly had an audience with Arun Jaitley, with whom they were discussing the place of opinion makers in society. Jaitley, the late BJP leader who was considered the key link between his party and the English-speaking left-sympathizing elite in Lutyens' Delhi, told the two editors that the English-speaking opinion makers do not matter anymore. The narrative is no longer being set by them, Jaitley told them. Ironically, in the 1990s, when the English-speaking public sphere was dominated by the left, it was Jaitley, along with Advani, who slowly and arduously helped cultivate a group of intellectuals and opinion makers who could put forth the point of view of the right in the language. It was a time when India, it was widely believed, was run by the Lutyens consensus. Lutyens, most commentators say, was a clan of 3,000 to 4,000 people, bureaucrats, diplomats, MPs, top English editors, cabinet ministers, who believed in the Nehruvian idea of India. They subscribed to Nehru's ideas of secularism, the country's composite culture, and who, as senior journalist Sheila Bhatt puts, thought that Indian progress was contingent on the country's strides in science and technology, its separation from religion and faith, especially overt Hinduism. Anyone who thought otherwise had limited space in the English intellectual and public sphere.
70s, for example, when people said the right wing, in the English language, it meant the people who wrote on economics, mainly who were the critics of planning, of the state-controlled public sector, included people like A.D. Shroff, the Forum of Free Enterprise, Nanani Palkiwala, they were that. And loosely attached to the, associated with the old erstwhile Swatantra Party. What we see as the right wing today, if you have to look at its genesis, I think you have to trace it to the movement, the Ayodhya movement, particularly the Rath Yatra of L.K. Advani in 1990, and finally the demolition of the Babri structure in 1992. Those were very important things. We had to operate under extremely hostile conditions. We had to literally wage a guerrilla warfare to get published each time.
The 1990s were a time of great churning, which began to destabilize the tightly guarded intellectual and ideological reign of the elite. It was the time of the decline of the Congress Party, the economic crisis, the 1991 liberalization, anti-Mandal protests, the end of the Cold War, and the fall of the Soviet Union. Older consensuses, both economic and political, had to now be questioned. The inflection point of this social, economic and political churning, as just stated by Swapan Das Gupta, was the Ram Janmabhoomi movement spearheaded by L.K. Advani in 1990, as the right wing began to demonstrate its power on the street like never before. Ignoring it in newspaper columns became increasingly difficult.
And of course, L.K. Advani's personal role in cultivating a large number of people in this respect should also be remembered. But even then, there were just a handful. Among the seniors, there was Girilal Jain, Arun Shori, to some extent S. Gurumurthy, and I was a much more junior writer in that sense, but I did have a voice in that. After the Babri, after 1992, there was some one or two more people who joined in this thing. Ashok Malik being, Kanchan Gupta being another, and there was a little more presence of the right wing in the print version in newspapers.
Former Indian Express editor Arun Shori played a significant role in the shift that the English media was beginning to witness. In February 1989, Shori published an article in the Indian Express titled Hideaway Communalism, which was seen as the first of its kind, wherein a mainstream English newspaper was breaking the silence on the alleged history of temple destruction in the subcontinent. Two historians, Sitaram Goyal and Ram Swaroop, came in contact with Shori at this time and began publishing regularly in the Indian Express.
अंग्रेजी भाषा में उन्होंने जो लिखना शुरू किया, उनकी सोच ये थी कि इस तरह का साहित्य जो है उन्होंने जो बनाया वो हमारे इंग्लिश रीडिंग क्लास के पास नहीं जाता है। तो उन्होंने कहा कि मैं जो है हमारी जो इंग्लिश रीडिंग क्लास है उसके लिए मैं ये अंग्रेजी में किताब लिख रहा हूँ, ताकि हमारा साहित्य भी उनके पास पहुँचे और वो भी इस बात को समझें जो हम बात कहना चाह रहे हैं। क्योंकि ज़्यादातर इंग्लिश एजुकेटेड एलीट क्लास है, उनके जितने भी आर्टिकल्स अखबारों में आते थे वो प्रायः एंटी हिंदू होते थे, वो लेफ़्ट ओरिएंटेड होते थे। तो इसलिए उन्होंने ज़रूरी समझा कि उन तक भी हमारी रीच होनी चाहिए और वो उन्हीं की भाषा में उसी लेवल के ऊपर जवाब दिया जाए तो ज़्यादा बेहतर होगा। मलकानी जी और उसके बाद में भाटिया जी थे, वो बहुत उनका सम्मान करते थे और उनके बहुत आर्टिकल छपते रहते, रेगुलर छपते थे वहाँ पे। लेकिन बाकी उस समय जो मेन स्ट्रीम प्रेस थी, जितने भी अखबार थे, वो इस तरह के जो लेखक थे जो हिंदू पर्सपेक्टिव से बोलते थे, उनको उनके आर्टिकल्स को वो वेलकम नहीं करते थे। तो उनके आर्टिकल्स जो आए तो सबसे बड़ा जो काम हुआ, अरुण शौरी जी ने जब इंडियन एक्सप्रेस के अंदर वो चीफ एडिटर बने तो उनका जो पहला आर्टिकल आया हाइड अवे कम्युनलिज्म, उसके बाद सीताराम जी और रामस्वरूप जी से अरुण जी का संपर्क हुआ और बाद में वो संपर्क बहुत गहरा गया, बहुत मिलना जुलना। तो उन्होंने फिर अरुण शौरी जी के ने रामस्वरूप जी, सीताराम जी और हर्ष नारायण, A.K. चटर्जी, जो इस तरह के इतिहासकार थे, उनके आर्टिकल्स और ये अयोध्या मूवमेंट को लेकर के और डिस्ट्रक्शन ऑफ हिंदू टेम्पल्स को लेकर के फिर उन्होंने प्रोमिनेंटली छापे। लेकिन इंडियन एक्सप्रेस में ही छपे, बाकी और अखबारों ने भी इनके किसी के ना ही तो इनकी किताबों को रिव्यू किया, ना ही वो आर्टिकल छापे।
This was a time when the elite publishing houses did not publish the books of those subscribing to a right-wing ideology, not as generously as they do now anyway. In 1981, Goyal had founded Voice of India, a small publishing house in the mazy lanes of Delhi's Daryaganj, to publish his own books and of writers like himself. In 1990, Goyal Swaroop, along with Arun Shourie, published a book titled Hindu Temples, What Happened to Them? The book was released in Delhi's Himachal Bhavan by L.K. Advani amid a huge gathering presided over by then Times of India editor Girilal Jain.
See, that book is really just a collection of articles, no? And each of us must have been writing on various things. But what was happening at that time was that there were public issues that were coming up. Punjab had blown up. So I wrote on the Sikh self-image and how that would hurt the Sikhs and India. Now, I was not being pro-Hindu or anti-Sikh. I was writing about what would be good for India. And I felt, now, Mr. Kushwant Singh, nobody would say he's anti-Sikh because he was writing the same thing, but he was a Sikh. But in my case, you would say he's anti-Sikh. Similarly, when the state bent at that time, first to Bindranwale, then to on Rushdi's matter to Shahabuddin, on Shah Bano to Shahabuddin, I started writing about those issues. For instance, on Rushdie, I would write about you are banning his novel called The Satanic Verses, but what about the satanic verses in the Quran itself? Now again, that has nothing to do with Islam being anti or pro. It has to do with the banning of books. Similarly, Ram Swaroop, whom I hardly knew then, had published a book called Understanding Islam Through Hadith. Again, I wrote about how the book should not be banned. And here is the law on banning of books and how this book does not fall within that law. Again, it's nothing to do with Islam, pro or anti or anything. It is about that issue. When the Shah Bano case started, to the elderly lady to be given 70 rupees a month by a prosperous lawyer in Indore, and they say Islam is in danger. So I then started, is that the case? Then let me read Muslim personal law. So I would read Mullah's personal law. But from that I would read the Quran. But from that I would read the Hadith. From that I would read the books of the four main law schools in Islam. And I would write about them. It has nothing to do with Islam, pro or anti. It has to do with the state bending in the wrong direction. Then this Rath Yatra started. And all sorts of nonsense was being put out at that time. That no, Ram was some figure in Egypt. No, he was some Amir of Afghanistan. No, Ayodhya was near Cairo. Nonsense. So, no, there was no proof that there was a temple or not a temple. Okay, it's not proof there. What about here's the biography of the court history of Jahangir. This is what it says. What do you say about that?
The right's baby steps into the mainstream were there for everyone to see, and the English-speaking media began to be woken from their slumber, albeit grudgingly. In May 1991, India Today, for example, ran a cover story with the headline, "The Rise of the Scuppies." Scuppies, the article said, were saffron-clad yuppies. Top corporate executives, intellectuals, journalists, and lawyers, the piece argued, were quickly turning from yuppies to scuppies. Their favorite color was saffron. They wore sparkling white tennis shorts but with a khaki lining. They were jean-clad and Gucci-hoofed, but were only too happy to be part of the Ram Brigade, the article said. At the time when the Babri Masjid was demolished, the India Today magazine ran a cover titled "Babri Masjid Demolition, a Nation's Shame." The scenes will return like deranged ghosts to haunt those of us who were at the graveside to witness the burial of a secular dream, read the story. However, the space being given to the right-wing intellectual was steadily increasing, and it expanded considerably with the explosion of TV news debates in the 2000s right up to 2015.
The opening up of television, which really happened after 2000, was one opportunity in which this space expanded. But not so, it expanded, but there were many more right-wing people who wrote, were present in Hindi, but less so in English.
The deregulation of the television in the late 1980s and its absolute explosion in the 2000s began to shake the now fumbling Lutyens consensus foundationally. Arnab Goswami, for instance, was key to mobilizing the middle-class English-speaking nationalism in the final years of the UPA, said a journalist we spoke to for the story. The politicized English-speaking public that voted Modi to power was created through the television, the journalist said. But since 2014, the space of the right-wing intellectual has exploded unprecedentedly. 10 years into the Modi rule, one can safely say that the right has never been more mainstream. Newspapers, magazines, publishers, organizers of literary fests, for whom the right-wing intellectual was not just persona non grata, but perhaps also an oxymoron until a few years ago, are all lining up for their attention.
That expansion, which you talk about, really happened after 2014. Even as late as 2014 election, there were very few. It was after 2014 and the coming to power of the BJP, there was very many more television channels which openly started being supportive of the regime. Earlier, there was to some extent Arnab Goswami who was somewhat supportive, but the others, a whole load of people now are being labeled as right-wing for their supportive stance, and they are not only the anchors but also a clutch of commentators also who appear quite frequently.
Indeed, the right-wing intellectual space is becoming more crowded by the day. There are the likes of Vikram Sampath and Sanjeev Sanyal, who have produced works like the exhaustive 2-volume biography of V.D. Savarkar and chronicled the lives of armed revolutionaries at the time of India's freedom struggle, respectively. Then there is Jai Sai Deepak, who has introduced the language of decolonization in popular discourse for an entire generation of readers through his best-selling books. There is also Anand Ranganathan, Harsh Madhusudan, Rajiv Mantri, Abhijit Iyer Mitra, to name just a few. But the new lot is hardly a monolith. To begin with, there is a generational shift from the 1980s.
So the generational shift has been because of two, three things. The first is the fact that Narasimha Rao had those economic reforms that created a new middle class. An ascendant middle class is always tends to be much more nationalistic and much more right wing as a rule, much more rooted to their own identity, or at least seeking a validation through their identity. The second has been, social media. Because what social media has done is that it's ended the sort of editorial control that was exercised. Now, what has happened is everybody is their own editor. Every Twitter account, every Facebook page, every Instagram account is essentially a newspaper or a TV channel or whatever in their own right, YouTube. They get much heavier viewership, much higher readership than, say, regular print or news channels do. So there has been an empowering and there has been a boost or boom in the number of people willing to, look at things from a right-wing perspective.
We perforce had a greater organic relationship with both the BJP and the Sangh, which is not the case with the present generation of people, except one or two, perhaps. But a lot of writing is being done of varying quality, may I add. Some are quite good. I would say that, say something like Vikram Sampat's 2 volumes on Savarkar are extremely well researched and builds on that old tradition of rigorous right-wing historical writing, which unfortunately got snapped after the 1960s. As far as the others are concerned, there are people who are experimenting with some of the more theoretical constructs which are found place in the West, like post-colonialism. We are still, that idea is still evolving. I won't say that it's matured fully as yet, but it's work in progress. And there are others. Well, I think that the growth of a right-wing intelligentsia is still relatively new for it to have produced a vast body of literature. But yes, you can say that at one time, when it was a complete desert as far as it was dominated, a left-dominated intellectual scene, I think there is far more, or there are many more people who challenge those constructs.
Old-timers think the newer lot is less inclusive. The newer lot believes that that is a function of social media.
I would disagree. I think the right wing is extremely tolerant. The problem with all social media, and this is something we recognized with Al Qaeda when Al Qaeda had a first movers advantage in the dark net in the late 90s and early 2000s. We realized the thing about social media was it tended to polarize into extremities. That doesn't mean society as a whole is polarizing. It's just that the polarizing figures are much more prominent because they're more newsworthy. It's the same reason, for example, in that Lady Nidhi's show, there used to be one token idiot right-winger and the rest would all be left-wingers. Similarly, what Arnab does is he brings 3 Ghonchu left-wingers deliberately to make them look bad. So this was something, it was sort of straw manning in a sense that used to happen, which has it is not that it has become more extreme. It is that an extreme point of view tends to be more salient and it tends to be used as a straw man against which everyone is painted.
For someone like Arun Shourie, the key difference between his generation of writers and the contemporary ones is their relationship with the state. While the former were adversarial to the state, the newer lot is adulatory, he says.
People like us who have the great privilege of being able to read is to always counterbalance the bending of the state. We may be featherweights, we may be nobodies, but that's our job, to do our little bit to correct the balance. The one difference certainly is we were writing against the state. They are writing with and on behalf of the state. That's a very big difference. And it makes for a very big difference. And then today it is the fashion.
In the final days of the 2019 election, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had famously said in an interview to the Indian Express, मोदी की छवि दिल्ली के खान मार्केट के गैंग ने नहीं बनाई, लटियंस दिल्ली ने नहीं बनाई. 5 years later, it is safe to say that it is not that the old Latins has been replaced by a new set of historians, academics, or journalists. With the rise of the middle classes, the explosion of social media, and the larger shift from an elite to a populist consensus, Latins as we have known it has ceased to exist. Modi or the RSS, as most right-wing intellectuals themselves agree, need no interlocutors. You can find the link to the article on the evolution of the right-wing intellectual over the last 3 decades in the description box below. Thanks for watching.